parents saw that they were sending their kids to Caesar, and they're no longer surprised that the kids are coming home as Romans.
All right, today I'm lucky to be joined by Corey DeAngelis. He goes by many titles. He's very accomplished, but my favorite is School Choice Evangelist. Corey, how do you feel about that title, and what got you into the game? Why did you make that your single issue?
I love it. Yeah, the DeAngelis, the evangelist, has a little bit of a ring to it, doesn't it? That was the liberal media. I think it was the Arkansas Times, a progressive media source, slapped that title on me, and I kind of ran with it. Maybe I should add it to my Twitter profile. Wait, actually, I already did it. It's there, DeAngelis, the evangelist.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what got me into this, I really started as a researcher at the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD in their Department of Education Reform, and I basically exclusively studied school choice programs and did papers, peer-reviewed articles on these programs when I was there. And my first study, which really thrust me into the national conversation, looked at the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, one of the longest-standing modern-day private school choice programs in the country. It started in 1990. Well, my co-author and I got a hand of the longitudinal evaluation data, student-level data, and we were able to track these students using the program compared to their peers in the public schools over time until they were about 25 to 30 years of age. And we found that getting to use the program after adjusting for the background characteristics of the students and their households, they were substantially less likely to commit crimes, and they were also substantially less likely to be involved in paternity disputes, which could result from teenage pregnancies. And in fact, there's another study from Harvard and Princeton researchers in the Journal of Political Economy from New York, finding that getting access to a charter school in New York City reduced the likelihood of females reporting a teenage pregnancy by 59%. So there's now been 6 studies linking school choice to crime reduction. I've done 2 of them. They're all peer-reviewed, finding huge reductions in crime. So that kind of got me thrust into the national conversation. I really like to look at non-test score outcomes because parents are choosing schools for a lot of different reasons. And a lot of those things are not captured on math and reading standardized tests, which are important metrics. You want academics to be doing well, but families getting a school that's aligned with their values is much more important. And developing the character of that student is more important to their long-term development and lifelong outcomes. So, and I think that's also what's interesting is why we're seeing so much success for school choice today. Something that I was researching a long time ago is something that is really fueling the school choice movement today is parents got to look at what's happening in the classrooms because of the so-called remote learning, which we really should have just called remotely learning because the kids weren't learning much of anything.
Yeah.
Because the unions lobbied the CDC to keep the schools closed as long as possible because they knew that if the schools were closed, they could say, well, we're closed because we need more money. So they got ransom payments from the taxpayers. It worked for them ultimately, but it backfired because parents saw that they were sending their kids to Caesar, and they're no longer surprised that the kids are coming home as Romans.
Oh my gosh.
And so this kind of really changed the dynamic for the school choice debate. Parents who thought their kids were in good public schools started to see there's something else going on here, and I don't want my kids to be brainwashed in values that aren't aligned with mine for 13 years. That woke parents up, and it's something that they'll never forget. They'll never forget how powerless they felt. And that's just kind of the research is how I got into it, but I also benefited from school choice in San Antonio, Texas. I attended a magnet school in high school. I went to government schools, all K through 12, but I had the opportunity to go to a magnet school in high school, still run by the district, but at least you're not assigned to those schools. They can have their own admission standards, and it was actually on the campus of my residentially assigned school, and I saw a night and day difference. It was a huge opportunity for me. It was a great environment. And I think other families should have those opportunities, but the money shouldn't only follow the child to a government school. You should be able to take that funding to a private school, a religious school, or even a home-based education option. And then I also come at this from a limited government angle. I mean, the most socialist institution that we have in American society today is the K-12 government-run school system. I mean, we don't do this with anything else. Even if we have taxpayers fund other industries like groceries, for example, for low-income families, we have food stamps, SNAP, and other programs. You can take that funding to a private grocery provider. You could take to Walmart or Trader Joe's or Safeway or any other provider. You don't have to go to a residentially assigned government-run provider of groceries. And I think whether you support or are against food stamps and the current level of funding for those programs, we can all agree that if the money is going to be allocated, it should go to people and they should be able to choose the provider. I'm just making the same argument for school choice when look, we're funding it through the taxpayer, but we shouldn't force families just based on their zip code to go to a particular school. They should have that funding go to them, and they should be able to spend it on a religious or non-religious education or a private or a public education. It should be up to the family.
And I'm going to do my best to unpack all of that. I mean, so much of that is so good. First off, the best nicknames come from your enemies, right? I mean,
That's
you can't
right.
just make up your own nickname, so run with it. School choice evangelist.
Hey, a Democratic representative from Oklahoma called me the school voucher king. All right, I didn't think my enemy was going to call me king of something, but I'll take it.
They are gassing you up, seriously. So to go back to the start, you started off as somewhat of an academic, and a piece that Chris Rufo just wrote was super interesting to me. He was talking about how this movement kind of gained momentum and started racking up wins because the school choice option, like you said in Milwaukee, it's been around for a long time, but we haven't really seen widespread involvement of other states, of other programs. And part of what I think the shift was this change in language. And I think you've mastered it. So can you explain to us right in the beginning of that momentum, what was the language shift? What was the change in framing that allowed this to just spread like wildfire?
Yeah, Chris cited me in that piece too, so I want to give a shout out to him. Thanks for the shout out. I think this piece came as a result of one of our meetings that we had recently in Los Angeles. It was a great discussion about the school choice movement and all the wins we've been seeing. But I think the first linguistic shift that I contributed to the debate is instead of calling it school choice when trying to convince the marginal voter, I started talking about it in clearer terms of the idea that we should fund students, not systems. There's a couple of benefits to that linguistic technique in that, or framing at least, in that when you say fund students, not systems, if you want to try to argue with me, you are all in this weird predicament where you have to try to say why it's a better idea to fund the system or the building and not the student. So it puts the other side on defense. And I feel like the school choice movement has been on defense for far too long, trying to explain why parents should have the right to educate their child in the best way that they see fit. Now, the other side's on defense. Why shouldn't families have that opportunity? Why should the money go to a government institution when it could go to families directly instead? The other benefit of that linguistic framing is that we can bring in analogies like I already did during this conversation that people who typically vote against school choice, they support all these other programs where the money goes to people who have a decision in the matter. With food stamps, you have Democrats supporting that. You have Pell Grants for higher education, for example. You can take the money to a private or public, religious or non-religious provider of higher education. You can take your Pell Grant dollars, which are taxpayer dollars, to Notre Dame University, for example. Nobody has a problem with that. This also it cuts against the other side's argument, which is another four-word phrase that they repeat on the other side, which is public money, public schools. Well, the first response to that is there's no such thing as public money; it's taxpayer dollars.
Yep.
And then the second response is, well, okay, if that's what you're going to go with, how about Head Start for pre-K that can be used at private institutions? How about food stamps that can be used at private grocery stores? Medicare, Medicaid that can be used at private, even religiously affiliated hospitals, Section 8 housing vouchers. You can go on and on and on with all this so-called public money that could be used at private institutions. And when you hit them back with that, they don't know what to say because they've been so brainwashed to support this notion of public money, public schools. They thought it was a good idea until you think about it for 2 seconds. I've seen some of my opponents actually freeze in their tracks because they literally haven't thought about it in this way before. They're like, oh crap, he's right. I do support actually public money going to private, everything else. When I usually hit them with Pell Grants, they'll say, well, those are adults. And then you come back with, well, food stamps can be used for kids. Pre-K dollars can be used for kids. So then they're dead in their tracks with that technique. But that's just the first shift, was bringing in the analogies, talking about it in terms of the money following the child, talking about it in terms of who does the money belong to? Does it belong to the parents and their kids? And are they the best people to make those decisions, or is it the government? Michael Malice said it best. Socialists regard your property as their property, but even more nefariously, regard your children as their property. And so we've been having a debate over the past couple of years about parental rights, which is kind of a bigger umbrella, and school choice kind of falls into the parental rights umbrella. And I would argue that school choice is the only way to truly secure parental rights in education. All these other reforms that kind of write it into law that parents have rights are steps in the right direction, but they're not as powerful as giving that funding directly to parents to allow them to decide for their own kids.
Yeah.
Before we move on to what Chris actually wrote more so about was, we made the argument for school choice for a long time based on kids being in failing government schools, having low test scores, which is true. That's a good argument for choice, that no one should be assigned to a school that they cannot escape, particularly low-income families, without any exit options. So like school choice is an equalizer, allows for more opportunities. But since families got an eye into the classroom, the arguments have shifted more towards values and this idea that you should be able to raise your kids in values that are aligned with your own. Parents got to see that the schools were doing more indoctrinating than educating. And once parents pushed back, they got labeled as domestic terrorists for pushing back at school board meetings. The system came out against them. The FBI was leveraged against parents pushing back. And that was a light bulb that went off for millions of parents all across the country, fighting for the right to educate their children as they see fit. So the argument has shifted away from test scores, which is still important, but towards things like safety and values and religion, and being able to raise your kids in ways that teach those kids not to hate you when they grow up. I mean, what parent wants their kid to learn for hours and hours a day for 13 years that their parents' values are evil? That is more powerful, more mobilizing for parents. And that's why we're seeing so much winning. And the other benefit here is that when you talk about it in terms of values, you include parents from all different backgrounds. Because the problem with the current system is it's a one-size-fits-all disaster that by definition will never meet the individual needs of families who just inherently are going to disagree about how they want their kids raised. A one-size-fits-all system will never be able to solve that problem. The only way forward through freedom rather than force is to fund students directly and allow families to choose schools that best align with their values. And that should also give the public schools an incentive to focus more on education as opposed to indoctrination, and to improve the test scores and other outcomes such as safety at the same time. And when you include parents from all different backgrounds as opposed to just targeting it to the least advantaged, well, now you're more likely to get political victories because you have politically advantaged groups pushing for the policy change. And maybe that's also why we're seeing universal victories this year. And what I mean by that is all families being eligible, because all families should have a choice. It shouldn't be limited to certain categories of students. We shouldn't be picking winners and losers. We should have all families eligible. And in the past 2 years alone, we've had 6 states all go all in on school choice in 2 years. The momentum is astounding, and we should really give a trophy to Randi Weingarten and the teachers unions for overplaying their hand and awakening a sleeping giant. These parents who are the new special interest group in town, who care about their kids more than anybody else and outnumber the teachers unions as well. We're going to win this war they've waged on families.
Oh, absolutely. And from a Catholic perspective too, parents are the primary educators of their children. It's actually a charge given to them when they become parents from God to do that. So I feel like this message definitely fits with the Catholic model for education as well. And I wanted to go back to, so Randi Weingarten, is it Randi Weingarten?
Weingarten.
Randi Weingarten. Is that correct?
Weingarten.
Sorry. I just block her name out of my head because...
She was having a total meltdown at the Supreme Court the other week. I don't know if you saw that, but she was like, oh, this really pisses me off, because they were talking about student loan forgiveness, for example, at the Supreme Court, and it was really pissing her off that she said that they were even considering this at the Supreme Court. And just wait until you see her reaction when she realizes how much she is losing control over the minds of other people's children, because we're freeing families from her clutches once and for all, and there's not a dang thing we can do about it. 6 states, universal, over 10% of states in just 2 years. when we've been chipping away at this incrementally
Yeah.
for decades now. We're finally winning,
And
they're losing control, and they can't stand it.
let me set the stage here because everyone loves a good rivalry, right? And so she's the president of the AFT and a humongous teachers union. And I
Yeah.
think it goes back to what we were talking about in 2020 when schools shut down and kids lost basically an entire year, sometimes in some cases 2 years of education. And not only that, Zoom learning, people were seeing that there's a lot of really gross indoctrination
Sure.
going on. A lot of that's being defended by the teachers unions, right? So we have you in one camp and this awesome rivalry between you and the teachers unions. How did that, for you, how did that first start of like trading barbs over? She felt like she had control over what was going on, and now you are like, wait a second, no, I have a different path. And then all of a sudden, you guys are button heads.
Choose your fighter. I think we're winning this battle. But I mean, yeah, they explicitly lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools in person. And affiliates of her union, like the Chicago Teachers Union, they even tweeted out that the push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny. They were throwing everything at the wall to see that what would stick. And you even had CTU. They deleted that tweet because it was
Awful.
so
They got ratioed
overplayed their
into
hand.
oblivion.
It got
Yeah.
I replied with a CNN article to refute them, saying that if anything, the school closures were disproportionately harming non-white students and low-income students. So their tweet was, if anything, the reverse of reality. And I think they realized that, and shortly after, deleted the tweet. It blew up in their face. We have screenshots, though. We have the receipts for days. And they, even in 2022, they were striking. They voted to strike in 2022. 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation of children. And it was all to get more money. They held children's education hostage to secure multiple multi-billion-dollar ransom payments from the taxpayer. And it worked. They received $190 billion in so-called COVID relief since March of 2020. In Chicago, it was about $8,000 per student. And in the most recent school year, they were spending up to $26,000 per student and still not going back to work. You had their board member vacationing in Puerto Rico in person while railing against going back to work in person. If it was safe enough to go to Puerto Rico, why wasn't it safe enough to go to work? If it was safe enough for the Catholic schools to be open in the same city, why wasn't it safe enough for the overfunded government-run institutions to be open at the same time? It was clear as day for everybody to see. It's because they knew they got your money in the public sector, regardless of whether they opened their doors for business. The private schools, the Catholic schools, they had an incentive to cater to the needs of their customers. So all across the country from the get-go, the Catholic schools were able to figure it out. They were able to have their doors open for in-person instruction. And you know what? On the nation's report card's latest results, if the Catholic school sector was a state, it would have been the highest performing state in the country, because the Catholic schools didn't lose basically any ground academically on the nation's report card scores this most recent go around, whereas the government-run schools lost decades of learning as a result, partially, of the school closures that were induced by the teachers union. So,
And a lot of those
I mean,
Catholic schools gained enrollment at that time too.
That's
People
right.
just jumped
That's right.
ship because they're like, I need to educate
people were
my
voting
kid.
with their feet. I mean, you can look at surveys to what parents want, but what really reveals what parents want is their revealed preferences. How do they vote with their feet? And we saw charter school enrollment increase, Catholic school enrollment increase, whereas the government schools, latest data that I've seen is they've lost about 1.3 million students relative to pre-pandemic levels. Families
Wow.
are homeschooling, they're going to Catholic schools and charter schools. So that reveals what parents actually want. But throughout this whole process, you had Randi Weingarten acting like they didn't do anything wrong. She even put out there that she was fighting to reopen schools the whole time. In fact, she was the reopening champion. She even said that we were fighting to reopen schools since April of 2020. And it's like, well, if that's true, if you guys were actually fighting to reopen schools, one, if we believe that you are sincere in what you're saying, why weren't they open all across the country? Why were you so incompetent? So at the most charitable interpretation is that they were incompetent. But it's worse than that. They actively put up as many barriers as possible to reopen schools. Randi Weingarten was saying that you needed to have 0 cases of COVID in D.C., I think it was, in order to, and if there was any cases, that they would quarantine and close the schools and create all these this mess. They were fighting to get in front of the lines for the vaccines, and once the vaccines were available to the teachers, they were still coming up with other reasons why they couldn't open the schools. You had Randi Weingarten's union, the AFT, threatening safety strikes at the beginning of all of this when districts were considering reopening in person. Some people point to Florida and say, well, look, some states were open, but that was despite the best efforts of the union. You had the Florida Education Association file a lawsuit against DeSantis because he wanted the schools open. It's just so that the teachers unions don't have as much sway in red states like Florida as they do in places like Chicago. If the teachers unions were as powerful in Florida and other states, you probably would have had more closures in red states too. And we've had 6 studies now, at least, and I've done a couple of them, peer-reviewed, finding, not all of them are peer-reviewed, but mine are, finding that places that had stronger teachers unions were substantially less likely to reopen in person, all else equal, after adjusting for the demographics and the politics and, red versus blue areas. Even after controlling for all that, income levels and everything, teachers union locations were much more likely to go remote and not reopen in person. Similarly, Michael Hartney and Leslie Finger, in a 2021 peer-reviewed article, found that public schools that had more Catholic schools nearby, the public schools were more likely to reopen too, because of competition, because the Catholic schools were the lower cost private schools in general. And when families at least had some type of exit option to these open schools, the public schools, all else equal, were more likely to open too. So competition can be a rising tide that lifts all boats in terms of test scores, but also in terms of just being available and providing the service.
And actually, I wanted to ask something on that, because I think when it comes to school choice, there actually still are some people that are a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that, well, if kids leave a public school, that public school might have to close. Therefore, there won't be education options for people. And I kind of see that as a fallacy, but what would you say to answer a question like that?
One, you should be focused on the kids, not the buildings. But then 2, there's no evidence for that. Show me a place where a school has closed because of a school choice program. We've had school choice for decades all across the country, and it's always fear-mongering without any evidence. However, our side has tons of evidence showing the opposite is true. School choice doesn't destroy public schools, it makes them better. We have 29 studies altogether on the topic, and 26 of the 29 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the outcomes in the public schools. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. It doesn't destroy them, doesn't defund them, it makes them better. And look, at the end of the day, the money doesn't belong to the buildings, it belongs to the kids and their families. Education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, whether that's public or private. And if you think about it, mathematically, the public schools actually end up with higher per student revenues and expenditures as a result of school choice, because in Arizona, for example, they have a universal school choice program. Their government schools spend about $14,000 per student per year, but the average education savings account funding that follows the student is tied to the state funding, not the local and federal funding. So it's only about half that actually follows the student to the savings account, which is about $7,000 in Arizona. Public schools get to keep thousands of dollars for students who are no longer there. So on a per student basis, they end up with more than $14,000 per kid, the more that people leave. So just imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and you wanted to go to Safeway or Trader Joe's, and Walmart got to keep half your grocery funding each week. That would be a great deal for Walmart. I would argue it's also a good deal for public schools that they get to keep any money at all for students are no longer educating.
And I think one of my favorite parts of this drama is you're very active on Twitter. I highly recommend go follow him. But one of the things that the silver bullet I think you've discovered is that politicians that argue against these programs often do not send their kids to public schools. So they'll say, well, it belongs to public schools, it belongs there. And then the silver bullet tweet is, you sent your kids to public schools. To private schools, and it's easy to find. When did that
It is nonstop. And politicians are more well-to-do, so they're more likely to be in private schools than the general public.
Right.
And this hypocrisy is nonstop. I think one of my biggest national stories was actually in 2019, not too long ago, during the Democratic primary for the 2020 election. And Elizabeth Warren and others had responded to a candidate survey from Education Week. And the candidate survey was pretty simple. It was, where did you go to school? Question 1. Question 2, where did you send your kids to school? pretty basic. And all of them basically had responded. And Elizabeth Warren responded too, but she only responded to the first question, not the second question. She said, I went to Norman Public Schools in Norman, Oklahoma. No response for the this is a short survey. You should be able to fill out the second part. So that had a light bulb go off in my head. And I said, you know what? If she sent her kids to public schools, and since she rails against school choice and so-called privatization, she would be bragging about how she sent her kids to public schools. So something's up here. And so I started scouring the internet and could not find anything. Her son, Alex Warren, for example, is over 40. He's like 46 years old or so. And you can't find much information about him online. You can't even find a bunch of pictures of him. And I thought it would be pretty simple to find where he went to school, especially if he went to a public school. It took quite a while. It actually took me, it required me to get a premium version of Ancestry.com to find yearbooks. And I searched for Alex Warren and his date of birth, which was publicly available information. And I found one yearbook photo. It was from his 5th grade school picture at Kirby Hall School in Austin, Texas. And I was like, wait, Elizabeth Warren lived in Austin, Texas? Yes. At the time, she was a professor at UT Austin. And at first I was like, this can't be true because, Alex Warren, it could be a coincidence. There's a lot of people, that's a common name, right? But I found one picture of him in a family photo around the same age, put them together on Twitter, and I said, this looks like the same person to me. It turned out it was the same person. He went to private school in Austin, Texas, and then later on in Pennsylvania. It was later revealed as well. And then as this is all going on, there was a video that I made go viral as well because I just exposed her hypocrisy. And she's doing a campaign event in Atlanta, Georgia. And there was a mother in a video questioning her about school choice and charter schools and other education reforms. And the mother, who's also a grandmother, Sarah Carpenter, had asked Elizabeth Warren and pushed her on this video and said something along the lines of, I just want the opportunities you had for your kids. I read somewhere that you sent your kids to private schools. And Elizabeth Warren very quietly and calmly said, no, my kids went to public schools. So she lied. She said, no, they didn't.
Yeah, she's never famously lied about anything else like her ancestry,
exactly.
Right?
So this was just another, addition to her long list of lies. Elizabeth Warren,
Pocahontas, as some people call her. Yeah.
Exactly. So that, Joe Biden went to private school, sent his kids to private school.
Yeah.
You see, Gavin Newsom, he was complaining about Zoom schools in the public schools while sending his own kids to private school that had in-person available. It was just nonstop hypocrisy. Nancy Pelosi sent one of her kids to private school. So there's tons of evidence of this. I live in Texas. I've been calling out a bunch of the Democrats here. The chair of the Texas House Democrats, who said that if Abbott wanted to push for school choice, then the Texas House Democrats would be his worst nightmare. Yet this guy went to a private school and sent his kids to private school. And it's like, I don't have a problem with you sending your kids to private school. Everybody should have that option though. And you shouldn't pull up the ladder from behind you and say you're for low-income families having choices,
totally.
and then block that opportunity whenever you get the chance. Because the only rebuttal they have, and it blows up in their face every time, is they'll say, "No, this is different. I paid for it myself." Everybody already has school choice. Just pay for it yourself. Don't ask taxpayers to pay for it. It's like, wait, didn't you just say yesterday that you were for student loan forgiveness for college and having taxpayers pay for that? Aren't you for taxpayers paying for literally every other industry? Why not for K through 12 education? Oh, it's because you're owned by the teachers unions and it makes you look like a hypocrite.
Right. And one of the hallmarks of this podcast is we kind of invite our listeners to get involved. They're very active politically. And this is an issue I think many Catholics can get behind, right? Because they want the opportunity. Homeschooling's huge. Catholic schools are huge. Charter schools are huge. So for them to get involved in this movement in their state, even if they're in a red state, you've mentioned to me that there's still opposition to this kind of thing. What's the best way for them to get involved in this fight in a very active and effective way, as you've kind of shown?
Follow me on social media and you'll be able to track the bills that are active in your state, because you need to coalesce around a bill and get the dang thing passed and then have people sign up for the program once it is passed. But the first step is to find the bill and get as much momentum and support behind that bill as possible to pressure the legislators to pass it. So in Texas, for example, the main one moving through the Senate right now, it passed through Senate Education Committee 10-2, with both of the Democrats who voted against it, both went to private schools themselves, might I add. But it's Senate Bill 8, for example. So know that bill number in your state, contact your legislators, make sure they support it. And also, you can sign the Education Freedom Pledge. And I have a website for you to do that, to track the bills that are moving in your state, and also to voice support of the bills that are moving in your state. But that's educationfreedompledge.com. And for short, you could also do just ED Freedom Pledge, edfreedompledge.com.
Okay, awesome. We'll have both that and your socials for sure. And a fun thing that I like to do is retweet what Corey does and say you went to private school, and you will instantly get a ton of likes. It's really addictive. So highly recommend. Corey, seriously, thank you so much for taking the time. You're a busy guy. I hope you well on the freedom trail for education.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.